IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, my name is Rohan Seth. I am joined here today by Prateek, Waghre and Sapni Ji Krishna. We have a bunch of stuff to talk about regarding Apple competition policy and the Competition Commission of India. One of my favorite bits of sort of doing this podcast is to get into the weeds of stuff with Prateek and Sapni, especially tech policy stuff. And if you like the kind of stuff that we talk about, then maybe consider signing up for our postgraduate program in public policy. Applications are now open, and we will put a link to the description in the show notes. Right, Prateek, Sapni, welcome to All Things Policy. Let's get started and talk about the developments with CCI and Apple. So, Sapni, do you want to give us a little bit of context on what's happening on that front?
So sometime in September, this non-profit based out of Jaipur, I guess, called Together We Fight Society, they submitted information to the Competition Commission of India alleging that Apple is involved in abuse of dominant position and is in contravention of Section 4 of the Competition Act, which essentially says that the entity is abusing its dominant position in the market. So something very interesting that comes out of reading this order is how the informants themselves, they got the opposing party wrong, that while filing the information, they filed the information against the marketing arm of Apple and not the distribution arm, which actually makes apps and content and the services available for consumers. So here the allegations that the informant makes is basically on three grounds. One, that the way the Apple ecosystem and the App Store ecosystem functions, there is a lot of restriction of options for the consumers. Second, that there is restrictions for app developers. They cannot get to the consumers directly through other app stores or their own independent ventures. And they have to mandatorily go through the knots that Apple has given within that system, within that ecosystem. And obviously the most important point being the payments, being in-app purchases and payments that are being mandated by Apple to be processed only through Apple's own payment processing system. So here the relevant market for these three allegations, these three bases of these allegations, which the informant makes, is firstly on the consumer end, and obviously also for the restrictions for app developers. The relevant market that is identified is the non-licensable mobile OS. So essentially, mostly we can broadly classify mobile OSs as two, right? One is the Apple ecosystem, the iOS, and the other is the open source one, which is Google's Android. So they identify non-licensable mobile OS, which technically zeroes down almost exclusively to Apple's iOS. And then they also identify App Store for Apple OS smartphones, which again comes back to the point of the three bases for the allegations I earlier mentioned. And finally, for in-app payments, they contest that the relevant market and the market players considered should be broadly the entire UPI system that we have in India, and not the relevant market. There should be, hence, within that ecosystem, it should be easy. It is then easy to identify Apple's in-app payment processing system as being dominant there. So while alleging abusive conduct, the informant alleges that the Apple App Store guidelines, that is basically the standard form contract that they provide, have no space for negotiation, which is a classic trait of all standard form contracts, right? And also then, obviously, the big elephant in the room is the issues with the payments side of this problem that Apple's App Store has, which is one, that there is excessive commission of almost 30% on transactions for in-app purchases. They compare it with other payment processors like Razorpay and BillDesk, etc., who charge between 1 to 5%. And they also allege that this deters innovation, since the high cost for competitors that contributes to Apple being able to absorb the costs within its own vertical, where resulting in absolutely higher costs for any competing entity that it has to. It either reduces their profit or they have to pass it on to the consumers. So here they also look at, very interestingly, how Apple becomes the merchant of record for in-app purchases, preventing direct access to the end consumer herself. So then they also move on to talk about, again, the mandatory use of in-app payment services, including the denial of market access to other players, and also the tying of markets, which is a very interesting idea that comes up, time and again in competition and antitrust cases, where the in-app purchase payment processing system is tied in with the App Store itself. The App Store use is conditional to the use of the payment processor that Apple has. And these tie-in arrangements are not per se illegal according to Indian law, but that is where a lot of conversation and debate can happen. And I think that's broadly how they have looked at and presented this set of allegations. The informant has presented this set of allegations, and it's an interesting sort of characterization.
Right. Thank you for that. I want to contribute here as host that a friend of the podcast, Mihi Mahajan and Anupam, of course, have joined before in some of these discussions. And one of the things that we often talk about is defining the relevant market. So generally, like if there's a big company, let's say Meta or Google, they'll try to make the market as broad as possible. And the person who sort of filing the allegation will try to define the market as narrowly as possible to prove that the company is a monopoly. And that is fascinating to me. So Prateek, do you want to take us through a little bit on what the relevant market is here, some of the key points and what Apple's been saying here?
Yeah, so I think Sapni sort of covered that, right? There were broadly three relevant markets that they identified. The first being the market for non-licensable smart mobile operating systems. The second being the market for App Store on Apple smart mobile operating system or just Apple iOS. And the third being the market for apps facilitating payment through UPI. Now, the third one is an interesting one because it hasn't really come up. It didn't really come up too often, even in the CCI order. And I remember when this even when this complaint had come out, this third one was one that at least left me scratching my head as to where it fits in, etc. Because while none of us have seen the original complaint in its full form, reports I think from Medianama suggested that even this market definition wasn't used too extensively anywhere else in the complaint. Right. That being said, right, just as you pointed out about companies are likely to try and define the market as widely as possible, and someone alleging dominance is likely going to define it as narrowly as possible. And that's exactly one of the things that Apple said in I think so they had about 10, 11 points that they had raised as contention that was listed at least in the report, right? The first being that the market definition was too narrow, and I'll quote because the phrase is interesting, right? It was tailor-made to falsely portray Apple as a dominant enterprise, right? And then they essentially used the consumer side of the market, to quoting IDC data, which says Apple's market share is somewhere in the 0 to 5% range. And because of that, if being such a small portion of the overall smartphone market in India, there's essentially no question of Apple having a dominant position. And then they also say that, and this one had me chuckling a little bit, was that switching OSs, the allegation of a dominant position is incorrect because switching OSs is essentially seamless, right? Which for anyone who's ever tried to switch from iOS to Android or Android to iOS, I don't know. While it's gotten easier over the years, it's certainly far from being seamless. And I think this is in so the Together We Fight Society, right, was also given the opportunity to file a rejoinder in which they contested this bit of it. And then for the relevant market, they went back to the second relevant market that the complaint had defined, which was the app stores for Apple Smart Mobile OS in India. And they said, look, even if Apple is 100% dominant, dominance itself is not an offense. You need to prove abuse, right? Or you have to establish that it's been abused. The other interesting one was because one of the charges was about the review guidelines, right, on the App Store being often unfair or arbitrary, and so Apple said, look, they're not unfair or arbitrary. Obviously, they would say that, and that they've been put in place to make sure that the App Store is safe and secure, right? And again, both can simultaneously be true, right? Depending on how and when you apply these rules. And then they point to the commission aspect of it, which I think at the time that the complaint was filed was 30%. I think since then, Apple has relaxed it a little bit to say that in certain conditions, it's 15%. And so they said, look, right now, most developers don't even pay a commission, and most of them that do only pay a 15% commission. And then they pointed to the Epic versus Apple lawsuit, right, which we've done a podcast on earlier. And they've said that the outcome of that suit was that it largely embraces Apple's App Store business model. Again, in the rejoinder, I think the Together We Fight Society said, look, that case is not really final yet, right? There are appeals. So it's a bit of a stretch to say that that has been largely embraced, right? And especially when you look at the global context and how different countries are in, looking at Apple's App Store very closely. I think for them to say that that model has now been largely embraced in the current day and age is an interesting one. Right? But of course, Apple would say that. And the final one was a bit interesting because they said that the informant was acting on behalf of parties, which Apple, I think, has commercial or contractual disputes, or they've complained to other regulators, right? Which I thought was an interesting allegation to throw in there, attacking the informant rather than the basis of the complaint itself. But yeah, that's largely how Apple has contested the charges.
And it's also interesting there to note that they actually went ahead and give that as a submission to the CCI, essentially even challenging the ability of CCI to sort of discern what the motivations are. And I think through the order, that's pretty clear. I mean, they sort of came down pretty heavily saying that, to me at least, it seemed to be of the tone that, we know what we do, so you don't have to say that. Right.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, exactly. I think they basically said that we'll intervene if the case has merit. Who the informant works with is not really relevant per se. Yeah.
That's quite interesting to me. I want to sort of also talk about Epic versus Apple and so on. But before we do that, let's take a quick commercial break.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. Episode 100! We've hit the 100th episode on Storytellers and Storytellers with Vineet Kanabar. Join us to take a look back at some of the best episodes so far. On Cider Says, Anushka Iyer, founder of Wiggles, tells Ciders all about her pet care company. They chat about their mutual love for pets and how to best care from them. On The Habit Coach, Ashton learns 3 habits to better your handwriting from graphologist Imran Beg. On Fin Talks at Bob World, Akhil Handa talks to Gurjot Pal Singh. He's the CEO of Tide In. They discuss its digital banking services. In a new series called Ek Sawal Kai Jawab, the Pulyabazi hosts analyze why the number of government companies is increasing rapidly. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. You can have a list of all of our shows at ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and CoinSwitch Kuber.
Hi, welcome back. We've got a bunch of stuff ahead to discuss, and I think it's good to sort of begin this section with Apple's business model. So the quote that always sort of has stuck out to me that Tim Cook says is that Apple works at the intersection of hardware, software, and services. And when I think about what he's saying there, is that when it comes to hardware, so like Apple became the first $3 trillion company recently, and when it comes to hardware, it sort of has the the supply chain of a Toyota and the margin of a Ferrari. When it comes to software, it sort of collects revenue through the App Store and a bunch of other places from developers. And when it comes to services, it asks its customers for stuff like iCloud Plus and so on. And it's just a super lucrative intersection to be at. But of course, with that has come its set of problems. And most recently, we saw this happen in the Epic Games versus Apple trial that happened in the US. Sabni, talk to us a little bit about that, how that went on, and your takeaway.
I think, obviously, as Prateek mentioned earlier, we've done an exhaustive podcast on that particular ruling, which I think we can link it to the description if you want to go back to listen what the intricacies of that was. But connecting that to this particular issue, I think, is this point within that rejoinder, which Together We Fight Society filed about the nature of cost of establishing and operating the App Store ecosystem vis-a-vis the income that is generated from the App Store ecosystem itself. That is a point that Apple seems to be making time and again, even during the Epic trial, the Epic versus Apple trial in the US. there was intense discussion. There was a lot of heat to that point on the contention that how much does the App Store really contribute to Apple's revenue. And it did turn out that a lot of Apple's high-flying executives were not quite sure what it was. And that wasn't quite revealed at the end of this trial either. So that is something the rejoinder also points to, that what the cost of establishing and operating that ecosystem is as compared to the income generation or the revenue generation that happens from the App Store, given that there is a 30% quote unquote expensive sort of commission that Apple takes away from there. It's quite compared to the other sort of companies that take commissions on the App Store model. Even Google does that, for that matter. There is comparatively a lot of advantage that these gatekeepers, as they have, and they take a lot of commission out of that. So that is a point of contention. I think that would come up again in India as well. But if in the US Apple did not budge and manage to give that breakup, I don't know if that'll happen in India. But that'll be an interesting point to watch, particularly in the Indian case, because in India the users are within the ecosystem is comparatively very less.
Yeah, I think Apple just tried to make the point that App Store commission is essentially their compensation for providing developers with a built-in user base. And again, I'll quote here because I'm not sure what they mean when they say this. Significant technical and marketing know-how. Right, that's the phrase that they use, which is interesting. But I think, as you said, right, it just needs to be backed up
with data
beyond just being a claim. Yeah.
Which is that data is quite obscure. I mean, nobody knows what that data is, and that for me is interesting.
Correct. I think, like you said, I think that part is going to be interesting, right, to see how they justify this claim.
Let's talk about this case a little bit, the implications, what the CCI has said, and so on, because I think it's quite fascinating how this is developing. So, you guys want to elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So, a couple of things to note there, right? Let me just go broad first, and then we can go into maybe the specific violation or the specific section that CCI says that there is a prima facie case. And I also realized that I don't think I've ever used that term on a podcast until Sapni joined us. So they've essentially said that, look, app stores are an integral part of the ecosystem now, and developers have a dependency on them, right? And that then they looked at from a user perspective, and they looked at the aspect of switching costs and multi-homing from a user perspective and a developer perspective. And they essentially said that, look, users are not multi-homing because the switching costs are high. And I think they pointed to some survey that Apple themselves provided, which said that I think only a limited number of iPhone and iPad users own non-Apple tablets or smartphones, right? But on the developer side, because they have to cater to a large number of users across different types of mobile ecosystems, developers do tend to multi-home in the sense that they're building across them, right? And then there are cross-site network effects that come into play. Interestingly, they've accepted the second definition, right, of the relevant market, which is the market for app stores for iOS in India, and they made a reference to a parallel or a previous case with Google, where I think the investigation is still ongoing, where it had accepted the definition for a relevant market for app stores on Android. So it cited that as the reason for accepting Together We Fight Society's definition, and said that, look, because of the dependency that these markets of app stores have as for the distribution of applications, there needs to be nuance in terms of how markets are defined. And again, I thought that was an interesting observation. They also disagreed with Apple's 0 to 5% market share claim, saying that, look, you're citing a consumer side number when the allegations here are with regard to anti-competitive practices with regard to developers, right? With app developers. So the relevant market needs to be defined from that perspective.
Right. Sapni, do you want to add on?
No, I think I'm observing this pattern that we're having interesting takes and sort of smart takes on, I mean, at least loyally smart in terms of reaching out to in terms of cases that are filed against big tech companies. So when you look at the Google case, which Prateek was mentioning, and this case also. And that's not limited to India. It's across the globe we see that. And obviously the rise of the antitrust movement, the so-called antitrust movement, may have a lot to contribute there. But I do think it is pretty interesting that we, at this point, we are, at least our competition commission and the Indian establishment, regulatory establishment, which sort of seems to run not very far ahead in understanding technicalities. In this case, I mean, it's pretty pleasantly surprising for me that they are looking at platforms from the perspectives that they are multi-sided markets. And this change is pretty new, and I hope that continues. And they understand the understanding of technicalities bit that catches on better.
Right. Prateek, I know you want to talk a little bit more about the details of this. So go on.
Yeah, so this is interesting, right? Because as they concluded, they essentially said that essentially 4.2 of the Competition Act, Section 4.2, talks about the abuse of dominance, and the CCI basically said that, okay, look, we need a more detailed investigation that the Directorate General will do. But as of now, it appears that there is ground for investigation of violations of, I think, essentially 4.2A, B, C, D, and E, which I thought was interesting. And I'll just talk about each of these briefly for a second. Right? So 4.2A is essentially when you're talking about, so I won't use the exact terms, exact legalese here. So Sapni, forgive me if or correct me if I make any inaccurate representations, because I'm speaking in normal English speak. Right, so there's 4.2A is essentially when there's unfair, discriminatory conditions or prices, right? And this was specifically in regard to the application of App Store guidelines, right? Which the allegation was that they can be unpredictable, they can be, again, to use the terms in the complaint, they can be capricious and discriminatory, which I thought was interesting. Then there's 4.2B, which talks about limiting or restricting production of goods and services, or technical and scientific development of goods and services. Again, this was an interesting one to note, because they're talking about the fact that, look, because the App Store rules do not allow anyone to create any sort of storefront for apps, or essentially a competing app store on iOS, it is limiting technical and scientific distribution because it reduces pressure on Apple to innovate. Right. 4.2C is talking about denial of market access, which again goes back to, given on which side of App Store review decision an app is on, it can lead to denial of market access. And they also take a forward-looking perspective of, the App Store part that I just spoke about, which is that they're essentially foreclosing any potential app stores or distributors from coming up on iOS, right? 4.2D refers to tying, and Sapni covered that earlier, which refers to the fact that if you have, if in a contract you have, you need them to accept terms that are not really connected to the services of the contract, then I think that's, and Sapni, feel free to correct me here, right? But that's essentially the tying aspect of it, which they refer to the fact that, look, that they've app developers to use Apple's in-app payment processing system, in-app purchases. So this, as per CCI, looks like they don't believe that this is connected to the contract for distribution. Right? And I think that's an important one, because there are parallels here with the law in South Korea as well. Right? And then the final one, 4.2E, which is about leveraging, right, which is taking dominant position in one relevant market and then using that to enter into another. And in that, Apple, the CCI essentially said that because Apple is putting itself in between the user and a developer, it can enter downstream markets and things like that, right? And I think they specifically gave the example of music, which I thought was notable, especially when you consider what's happening with Spotify as well. But yeah, those were the specific clauses that they believe may be violated, and that that there needs to be further investigation on.
I think I'll just add a bit to the tying in for 2BT. So basically, it talks about the difference. These are two, at least even to me, these are two separate products which need not necessarily go hand in hand to ultimately give the end user or the developer the characteristic that is needed, or to sort of put that into proper use. So the example of the payment processing system, so it can be completely different. It can have its own competitive sphere within, it can have its own market as against the App Store which in this case is completely forced together as against bundled together, which the law clearly makes a distinction. It's bundling together is basically when, say, probably if it was the case that if you use Apple's own payment processor, and it results in you having to give lesser amount of commissions as against, say, another payment processor like Razorpay or BillDesk, which in the hypothetical situation that they did have access to it. Then if they were trying to have these two separate services provided to you, bundled together at a lesser cost, discounts, etc., that would be completely different from the situation that we have at hand right now, where you don't have an option, and it ties back to the other provisions that Prateek mentioned, right? Where essentially you're restricting access to the market to other players, and it results in lesser competition, and then that one dominant position that the player has in one market and one side of the service is used/misused in another side of the market.
All right. Thanks, Sapni. That was supremely interesting. We'll look forward to more developments on this matter soon enough because as these investigations go on, 2022 is going to be a super interesting year. So tune in and keep listening to All Things Policy. Thanks, Prateek. Thanks, Sapni.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Do you like true crime stories? Do you like to learn about the people behind some horrible, awful crimes? More specifically, women that may have committed these crimes. Actually, Indian criminals that are women? Then we'd like to welcome you to our podcast, Misconduct. My name is Raghavi.
And I am Nisha.
We cover themes like murder, dacoity, drug trafficking, financial fraud, kidnapping, and many more.
You can catch us every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcast.
Eventually, you'll see the end of your childhood.
Get accustomed to womanhood.
Enjoy the experience of sisterhood.
Might get to wifehood.
Or not. Choose motherhood.
Or not. You'll learn to define your personhood.
Earn a livelihood.
Change the neighborhood.
And get rid of the falsehood that life post-academia is easy.
So join me, Ritasha.
And me, Ayushi.
On a journey from station starting point.
To station, what now?
Next station, Pudin station. And hopefully, Agla station, adulthood.
Fresh episodes out every Thursday.